really helps us be able to continue providing programming. And we want to make sure you're not aware that Ken Burns American Revolution 6-part series starts on November the 16th on PBS. And another way that you can support us is by supporting us with a local that is on November the 14th. The Heirs Foundation matches gifts on that day, and they will do double matches for 2 different periods. So the Lancaster County 250 is part of Give Local, and then 3 of our partners also have pages on Give Local. The Friends of Andrew Jackson State Park, they are fundraising to build a very large wagon display to use for educational purposes. Last year they raised $10,000 for that. The cost is $30,000, and so they're hoping to raise just as much this year. The Friends of Buford Massacre also has a page, and Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson DAR. So supporting us and all of those partner organizations greatly help us with developing programming for not just for next year, 2026, but also through 2033, which is when the South Carolina 250 will end their 250th anniversary. So thank you very much.
Saturday, everyone. We're all volunteers, so we have limited time. Please do come back into the museum when you can. You can reach us through the county's main number if you need to call us. Thank you and welcome.
Laura Ledford with Andrew Jackson State Park has a couple of announcements.
Good evening, everybody. We have our park land report coming up next month. It's the Saturday before Thanksgiving, November 22nd. We have tours at 1 in the evening, starting from 7 to 8:30, and they're about half an hour tours and those. During the tour, you will see any update on things that happen here in the town of Jackson.
Thank you. So welcome to our 250 engagement series. This is our last speaking event of the year, and then we will begin again in late January. We have a speaker coming from our painting rock, and that is going to be at the Heat Springs on Quad from last Tuesday in January. And all that information will be posted on our Facebook page. And then on February 23rd, that is a Saturday, we will do a presentation on patriots of color, so that's enslaved African Americans and Native Americans. They're going to do a presentation in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they're going to do a genealogical workshop, and that is probably going to be held at the Church of Indian Land. That flyer is going to be released in a couple of weeks. And then that one will require registration, and the registration is going to open the first week in January. So we hope that you'll watch our Facebook page to learn more about our events that are coming up. We have several interesting things happening next year that we're very, very excited about. And tonight we're very excited to have Debbie Eakins Scarlett with us. And Debbie has a presentation to make.
Well, thank you for having both of us, and this has been a delightful time for me as a native South Carolinian to come to Lancaster for the very first time. The very first time I see Kershaw for the very first time in my life, and I have to make a winding way here, back roads. That was fun. It was a lot of fun. Before we get started, before we introduce us, Ken, I wanted to present to your organization 2 of my creations that I call Palmetto Patriot Dolls. This is a female patriot. Each one comes with a certificate of adoption so that you can name your doll after one of your patriots. And I've got also for you, that's for you. This is another patriot doll.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And so then I'd like to introduce Ken. So Ken is the award-winning author of Victory of Native American Independence. And I don't, do you still have some books left for sale?
Where we don't have any more books here tonight, but you can order off of Amazon. We are on Amazon, and so if you need any information about that, I'll be happy to give it to you.
And the book is also available on Audible, and I'm currently listening to the book. It's a really good Audible rendition. If you like the books on tape, you know they're great for travel and everything. Ken is the president of Charleston 250. He is a South Carolina 250 commissioner and a Charleston Historical Commission commissioner. His research focuses on South Carolina and Charleston's crucial role in the War for American Independence and the interpretation of the papers of Nathaniel Greene. He is a recipient of the DAR Ellen Hardin Walworth Medal for Patriotism, the DAR America 250 Condemnation Medal, and the Francis Tavern Museum 223rd Honorable Mention Book Award. He has authored numerous articles pertaining to the American Revolution in South Carolina and has delivered lectures to numerous groups on the subject. He is scheduled to speak at the Smithsonian Institution during President's Week. I guess you did that this past year?
Coming up.
In 226. Ken is the former president of the Nathaniel Greene Freedom Monument Foundation, which funded and produced the statue of the General Greene located in front of the Upcountry Museum in Greenville. He holds a master's degree in security and intelligence from the Citadel and a business management degree from the University of South Carolina Darla Moore School of Business. He is also the former CEO of Scarlett Associates International and a veteran of Post 9/11 Domestic Security Operations and Joint Force Operation Command. He is the award-winning author of Victory Day, Winning American Independence. Thank you, Ken, so much for coming, and we're looking forward to this presentation on South Carolina and the Center of Hearing the American Revolution.
Thank you very much, Gina. Good evening, and thank you all very much for having me. If my voice needs to go up, just let me know, and I can bring it up to a command voice, but I don't want to frighten anyone with the command voice, so I'm going to try and keep it low. But if you can't hear me, I'll have to go up in my command voice. So it's an honor to be with such a distinguished group in such a beautiful historic setting, a building by Robert Mills. In Greenville, South Carolina, there's actually another building by Robert Mills, and I'm sure there's a few others in South Carolina. I'll be speaking tonight about possibly the most important period in South Carolina history, where present-day Lancaster County was what General Lord Cornwallis described as the hornet's nest. As hard as the British Empire tried, they could not conquer this key area during the American Revolution, and thus could not control the great wagon road that stretched from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to Augusta, Georgia. Now keep in mind, if you're going to conquer a country, if you're going to conquer the colonies, you have to control that road, the Great Wagon Road. You have to control the King's Highway along the highway. And you have to control the roads that connect to both of those roads. You're actually building a square around the colonies. That was the British plan. You put a big fly in their ointment. The British had to control this main road for their Southern Strategy plan to conquer the American colonies to succeed. Charleston 250 volunteers developed this public domain brand for historical organizations like your organization to attach their logos to promote South Carolina's substantial role in the war for American independence. You're going to hear me talk a lot about the war for American independence and what independence was all about and the different distinctions in independence, sovereign independence and home rule independence and different veins of independence. We were going for sovereign independence. Many of us share the same mission, researching South Carolina's big role in the Revolutionary War and teaching involving youth across South Carolina and the entire United States about the horrors South Carolina endured and triumphed over to enable the creation of a national government by the people that became the world standard for ethical governance and free enterprise. With that as a framework, I would like to share now accessible research about how South Carolina was the epicenter of a world war that would decide if America would become an independent nation of confederated states or a conquered people ruled by a foreign king. This presentation will take us from October 1781 to February of 1783. It will cover what many historians refer to as the lost year of 1782. How many in this room have really heard about what went on in 1782? Well, the war went on to 1783, but how many books do we open up today and see reference to all that South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina went through in the year 1782? Well, the reason is the papers of Nathanael Greene weren't made public until 2005. So we did not, that whole era of history, of military history, from the surrender of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown through to the end of the war was not available. Only in 2005, when the University of North Carolina Press completed a 29-year effort of taking all of those papers, restoring them, decoding them, translating them, and putting them into 13 volumes. So this is just one of the 13 volumes. We're talking about 8,000 correspondences, 8,000 correspondences that were hidden from history for a long time. This is why South Carolina is back on the map again, where they belong. So, the long-lost gaps of our revolutionary history and how we achieved collective sovereign independence can now be filled in. Researchers now have access to first-person information that reveals the real story of how the 13 proclaimed United States achieved collective sovereign independence in the latter stages of the war by kicking out all the British forces and all the King's men from the Lower South. When I talk about the Lower South, I'm talking about North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So when I refer to the Lower South, that's what I'm talking about today. So 244 years ago and 2 days, Cornwallis surrendered his army of about 8,000, some say 8,000, some say 8,500. Soldiers at Yorktown. Who did he surrender to? He surrendered to a joint operation of French and Continental. They were about equal. Most of the arms and ammunition were supplied by the French. Excuse me, the cannons, the siege cannons, the important siege cannon, and that sort of thing, were supplied by the French. So the French were all in. As a matter of fact, if you look at who signed the Articles of Surrender, you will actually see Rochambeau, and you will see also the Navy commanders, the French naval commanders, actually signing the document after Cornwallis and his people signed the document also. So the French were part of the whole, were an integral part of the whole operation. Integral part of the whole operation. The big thing that occurred with Yorktown is it stopped the British Southern Strategy Plan. Now, there were 4 British Southern Strategy Plans, and we don't have time tonight to get into the first 3. But the 4th one was on its way to being a big success until Cornwallis and his army was trapped. They were trapped on the peninsula, on the Yorktown Peninsula. A peninsula, by the way, that had no port, no ships, and was really in the boonies. So after that occurred, what happened? Does anyone recognize this flag? It's called the French Alliance flag, the French Alliance flag. And believe it or not, you know, because of AI and Google, we get to check all kinds of things out now. So now I'm going to sick you guys on this now. But this became the most prevalent flag flown in America after the surrender of Cornwallis's army in Virginia. So what's at the top? A fleur-de-lis. Do you know what the French flag looked like at the time? It had 3 fleur-de-lis at the top. That was it. In front of a gold on a blue field. And so look at the position of this. Where is it? Where is the supremacy? Where's the implied supremacy in this flag? When John Adams saw this flag, he was absolutely shocked. Absolutely shocked. He said, we are not going to be, the French are not our protectorate. We are not going to trade one king for another king. Okay, he was totally incensed by it. As a matter of fact, incensed so much, he wiggled the French alliance a little bit where they were thinking about leaving. For those of you, this is a good time for me to introduce, for those of you, excuse me, how many in here have seen the movie Franklin that was on Apple TV? Anyone? I would highly encourage you to do that. That stars, there's a famous American star, everyone else is mostly English in the show, but you'll see John Lawrence in there as well. But this all ties in to this area, what Franklin is doing, and when I get to the end of this, so it's all going to tie in. The person that assisted on this series of Franklin was a lady by the name of Stacy Schiff. Her and I actually share the same award from the Francis Tavern Museum for her book, Sam Adams. And now she received the Pulitzer Prize for her book. I did not receive a Pulitzer Prize for my book. But I have to say, you know, it's hard for me to say this, but she actually writes much better than I do. And as a matter of fact, I've mentioned to her before, I said, if I could write as well as you do, I would probably pump out a book a month. She pumps out a book every 3 or 4 months, so she's very good. She also has the New York Times behind her. But she was the technical advisor on this set. So you're going to see Franklin from the time he lands there, the time Congress sends him over there and says, you have to negotiate something with the French so we get arms ammunition. What did we not have around here? You didn't have very much around here when Thomas Sumter had that battle at Hanging Rock. What was it? Powder. And without powder, you can have all the guns in the world, but you can't shoot them, right? And guess who made the best powder in the world at the time? France. And because of the bat caves that they have there. No kidding. Anyway, so Franklin had to negotiate with the French to send over powder on the sly. This is way before Saratoga. After Saratoga, remember, the French came into and became recognized the 13 United States of America. That really put us on the map. So, here we are, October 1781. Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. What does the map look like? So if we're the negotiators in London, in Paris. What are we thinking at that point? First of all, Virginia is now in firm hands. The blue part of this map shows what the Continental's control now. This has instantly become a war of territory possession with the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. So take a look. And I want you to take a look at this map also, and I'm sure you're going to be looking at approximately where you guys are, right? Look at the blue part in South Carolina. I mean, this was the heart. This was that, as a matter of fact, Kip was showing me earlier how it was the center of the hand. And this is so important. Now, what are the British control? The British control, they control 7 ports. They still have 3 armies. They have armies located in New York. They have skeleton armies here, but they have big armies here in Wilmington, in Charleston, South Carolina, in Savannah, Georgia, and in St. Augustine, Florida. Okay? Not many people talk about St. Augustine, Florida. The good news in Florida, look at the chain of forts that they have. The British were all about chain of forts. And if you start looking around here and you have visited the forts around here, you'll notice that they're all related to one another. That comes from the Roman strategy of mutual support forts. And the British copied that plan exactly. We tried to copy that plan in Vietnam with not very much success either. So, and I'm going to show you more about that. But right now, if you're in Europe, a lot of people say, well, Yorktown, game, set, and match. Like the guy says on TV, not so fast. What are we going to do with the 40,000 British troops that are still here in America and all the ports and all of the territory that they control? So who gets to decide if we become independent? Well, we don't get to decide it. People in Europe get to decide it. The French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and believe it or not, the Austrians and the Russians have a real big say-so. And they're sitting around tables all the time and saying, well, look, let's see how we can carve this sucker up. Why don't we come up with a two-country solution where we carve that part off for either Britain, or else Britain can trade it to France, and then we can do something up here. Look what the British did up here. They wanted to establish a new province up there. They called their states provinces because they weren't republics. The king called the shots on what was going on in a province. And they named Maine, current day Maine, New Ireland. Fortunately, they couldn't get their royal government set up before the end of the war, so it was negotiated away. But it was part of Massachusetts at the time. But you see, this shows you that King George had no compelling reason to give up the fight and say to all of the 40,000 troops that are here, come on home, boys. Okay, that wasn't going to happen. But Yorktown was the beginning of the end. It changed the war. Now it wasn't a one-dimensional war. It was now a diplomatic war. It was a political war. It was an economic war. And it was a war of territory possession. So it went from being really singular focus, we're defending against ourselves, just like this area did during much of the war, defending yourself. It now became who possesses the territory. So when the deciders get together and decide who gets what, that's how we're going to decide. Not unlike what's taking place in the Ukraine right now. As a matter of fact, if you look at the eastern part of Ukraine, it's not so different from the 13 colonies during the American Revolution. If you look at the negotiations that are going on a daily basis, not so different than what was going on with the United States after Yorktown. And I put United States at that time was with a small u, and it often had quotations around it, and the British would not use it, plus they would not recognize Congress. They would recognize the individual colonies, but they would not recognize Congress. But what Yorktown accomplished is it ended British occupation of Virginia. Now check me out on this. King George actually talked about his army in Virginia, his defeat in Virginia. He was very specific. It was Virginia, 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 Virginia. So it did rid all of the British from the state of Virginia by Cornwallis' surrender. And it ended the occupation. Now half of Virginia was in ruins, as Richmond was burned to the ground, courtesy of Benedict Arnold, by the way, for one example. It took about 8,000 troops, and again, historians argue on whether or not it's 8,000 or 8,500, or, the number, it always seems to be argued about. But let's just call it 8,000 British troops out of the fight for America, okay? It also restored hope throughout America that a sovereign United States was actually possible. A sovereign United States. Not just a South Carolina colony or a Georgia colony or something like that. That the 13 United States actually had some gravitas to it. That, wow, we can actually be a nation. We can actually be our own thing with the 13 states still having their rights as well. As a matter of fact, how many people in this room know what the first motto of South Carolina was? See, this guy's an expert historian here. He ought to be up here. While I breathe, I hope. That was from the darkest days of the Revolution, where independence was just a hope. It was a hope as the British were coming through as like conquistadors and burning things and doing all kinds of very brutal things. And people were left with nothing. No gunpowder, no arms, no ammunition. And they really had to beg, and in many places. And that was the motto, while I breathe, I hope that we can get out of this. So it restored hope throughout America. It demonstrated the combined French and Continental Army could have a successful joint military operation. Keep in mind, they had failed down in Savannah. The Americans and French went and said, we're gonna take over Savannah. Nope, that did not work. Remember, Pulaski got killed in the desperate charge, and the great Jasper, who saved the day at Fort Moultrie, he was killed there as well. That was not successful. In Rhode Island, they had a joint venture. They tried again. That was a failure as well. But it gave hope to the idea that combined French and Continental armies could kick out all the king's forces and all the king's men from the rest of the occupied countries. We can do this. We can actually do this. We got rid of Cornwallis's army. Cornwallis was being marketed as the Hannibal of the British Empire, and he's been defeated. And if we can defeat him, we can defeat anyone that the British Empire throws at us. So here's the British situation. Lord Cornwallis, now this slide says 8,500, so I'm trying to please both sets of historians here, right? So, this picture is actually from Victory Day that we have down in Charleston. About 40,000 troops remain in the colonies. And where's the largest concentrations? In Charlestown, South Carolina, which is also British Southern Headquarters. Eastern North Carolina, Wilmington, and then Cross Creek, where Fayetteville, North Carolina is now, Fort Bragg. Those were two connected forts, and that river was connected as well. So that was a whole fortified area. And then you had Savannah, these are garrisons, and St. Augustine's. These are not little forts or encampments or something like that. These are big, strong, walled garrisons with multiple, very high walls, parapets, cannon, drawbridges. They look like medieval castles. King George orders all British forts and possessions are to be retained. That's a direct order from the king. You know what happens if you go against what the king says. When he says something like that, you're in big trouble. Big trouble. So British strategy shifts to maintaining territories in possession, breaking the French alliance, and splitting the colonies. That's the key to them. They say, okay, the British Southern strategy, which this was one of the pivotal areas, to be able to possess this area so that you have the Great Wagon Road that goes down to Augusta, and then you're able to control the road that comes up from Charleston. So you're able to control two very important roads that hook up with the King's Highway and go all the way south to Augusta, Georgia. So he says, you keep all those forts. I'm going to show you a picture of all the forts that we had in South Carolina at the time, or the British had at the time, and how many were in their possession. And the two-country solution was alive and well. Was alive and well. The Cherokee and Creek armies, allies, were still very potent. Very potent. King George, hold your position. All European eyes are on the lower south. So all these negotiators that are going to be the deciders, and King George, are looking at the lower south. Where's the territory possession? Whole new war. United sovereign independence is possible. Kicking the British out possible. United States Congress positioned to be recognized as a sovereign political entity in Europe. That is really big. For the first time, the negotiators and the mediators, both Austria and Russia at the time, were trying to mediate the war and so that they could get a piece of the land over here. And if you look at some of those discussions that stretched out for years, some of the requests that Catherine the Great had would really raise your eyebrows of, well, we're going to take this if we mediate your way out of this. So, but Congress is now finally being talked about as having a seat at the table. Now I'm back to Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin and Silas Deane and John Adams. Not so much John Adams because of his temperament, but Silas Deane and Franklin are invited to these informal discussions with the deciders of Europe. And that's why you want to watch this series about Franklin, because you'll be able to see exactly how that comes off. You'll be able to see after the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown how Franklin gets this done and says, we need a spot at the table in order for you to settle this thing. But most importantly to us, a pathway to independence was opened. Remember, the king wouldn't even talk about it. So what changed? What's the situation now in the lower South? Well, many of you are familiar with Major General Nathaniel Greene. He had come down after Gates had that terrible episode here down at Camden, right? Everyone remembers he replaced Gates. So he comes down, and now here's a combat veteran that had served with Washington since the beginning of the war. So everyone often portrays him as, well, here's a rookie who's coming in and he's up against Cornwallis. Well, wait a minute, it's 1781. This guy has been in the field for almost 6 years now. So he's a hardened combat veteran, and he has seen a lot. How do you change the situation? Well, you have to develop relationships, and if you read the papers of Nathaniel Greene, you'll have to brush up on your 18th century nomenclature. But if you do decide to do that, these are the people that he's talking with. From the military perspective, he's talking with, constantly communicating with George Washington. Light Horse Harry Lee. You know who Light Horse Harry Lee was? One of the great cavalry commanders and father of who? You got it. Anthony Wayne. Now, Anthony Wayne is there's a connection here in Lancaster. You know, Lancaster in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, you know the connection, right? There is a Pennsylvania connection. There's a connection also with Andrew Pickens. Well, Anthony Wayne is from Pennsylvania also, Waynesville. And there's your Pennsylvania connection. You got the Marquis de Lafayette that's on this. William Richardson Davy. Have you ever heard of him? Yep, heard of him. He became very, very important. He became a key logistics officer for Greene. Remember, Greene's trying to bottle up the British down in Charleston at this time, and he has no way to supply his troops except through the port of Georgetown that Francis Marion had recently captured, and Light Horse Harry Lee. And so he has to bring it down the Great Wagon Road and get it out there to him. Davy becomes very, very important for that because he's influential in North Carolina as well as South Carolina. And Burke is kidnapped. In the middle of all this, the governor of North Carolina is kidnapped. And now at the negotiating tables, they're saying, well, there's no government, there's no continental government in North Carolina, so it's in play again also. But these are the correspondences: General Alexander Leslie, Guy Carleton, Henry Clinton, and Lord Cornwallis. Many people think, well, wait a minute, generals are communicating with the enemy? Good generals communicate with their enemy, right? You want to make sure that you don't, when you are doing a movement or withdrawing wounded from the battlefield and things like that, you want to make sure that your movements are not misunderstood by the enemy, and you have to communicate with them. So communications with the enemy are very important for prisoner exchange, very important. For diplomatic reasons. And also they're writing Greene also and say, look, why don't you lay down your arms and we will stop fighting also. Trust us. These are the letters that are coming in. No kidding. Trust us. Look at these other relationships, political and civilian. Now this is one guy that comes out, he's given tremendous power by Congress. And Washington tells him, I can't advise you what to do. The situation is so complicated, I just leave it up to you to figure it out. He didn't say it like that, but that's, if you look in 18th century language what he said, that's what he said. So he has to figure all this out. He's down to Greene is sitting down there with only 200 effectives, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and 4 rounds of ammunition each. Against, and he's opposed by at least 8,000 troops down in Charleston. So politically, he's got to correspond with people like Christopher Gadsden, who he's able to get released in St. Augustine Prison. If you've never been down to the St. Augustine Prison, you do want to go there and look at it, because we have South Carolinians that were imprisoned down there by the British for long periods of time. And Christopher Gadsden was in solitary confinement for about 8 or 9 months. And if you see the cell, the dirt cell that he was in, it's a pretty scary place to be. 8 months. Destroyed his health. He also has to negotiate, has to constantly he has to hold elections. He has to communicate with Alexander Martin and Burke of North Carolina, Rutledge and Matthews of South Carolina, John Martin, presidents of Congress, John Banks. And do we know who John Banks is? He's the guy that he had to make a deal with to clothe his troops. They were literally had no clothes on, and he had to get clothes, and he had no money. So he had to pledge the goodwill of Congress to this guy. to get clothing. Diplomatically, the French now become the most important country in the world to the United States. And the guy, Vergennes, who you'll see in the show Franklin, they portray him very accurately because Stacy shifted the advising on that. So he wants to know what's going on, who's winning the Lower South. Are we headed toward two-country solution? Because who gets to gain if things don't go exactly right? You're going to see, France can possibly wind up with the Lower South. We could be speaking French today. Okay? So he has to communicate with them. Most of these communications, and here's Silas Deane also, you have Henry Lawrence and you have Ben Franklin. Okay? Many of these communications have to go in back channel. You have to follow protocol at the time. Otherwise, you can really wind up in bad shape and people won't talk to you anymore. So he has to go in sometimes 2 steps behind Vergennes, let them know how much territory he possesses so that that information can get to the negotiating table and it gets off of the negotiating table. And I'll show you how he did that in North Carolina in just a minute. Here's the most important relationship. Did you know that there was a 1-cent stamp with Greene in Washington? Very popular stamp. My grandmother had one. And we actually, full disclosure here, we actually used to live on Green Avenue in New York, right across from Fort Greene Park. So I kind of grew up hearing this guy's name. So if you wonder why did I get so interested in it, it was because when I was on the playground, everyone talked about the hero Nathaniel Greene. And believe it or not, I met my favorite wife in Greenville, South Carolina, named after Nathaniel Greene. So how about that? South Carolina and the Lower South are key. Peace with collective independence and free market system, new political expectation. That's the new expectation. But what they need is each state needs operating state governments. They need Army numbers. Not enough Army numbers. Need CAV units. Need supplies. Need effective diplomatic negotiations. British barbarity turned many bystanders into patriots. Now, how many in this room know this word, eleuthermania? Eleuthermania. Now I put the Greek word here, but the full word, the fever, is called eleuthermania. It's a word. It's an English word. It's an insatiable desire, almost like a compulsion to be free. Once that takes hold in a country, for Army officers who get deployed in different areas and everything, particularly in Africa at this point in time, they are on the lookout for this, because once it reaches a tipping point with a big group of people like it did in the United States at the time, you can't undo it, because the expectation is we're going to be free and we don't care what it takes. And once you cross that line or reach a tipping point, however you want to express it, then you can't unwind that. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, everyone caught the fever. It started a little bit in 76 with the spirit of 76, but it really took hold after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. You also need effective diplomatic negotiations. You got to have that. And fortunately, we had, when you see this movie on Franklin, you'll understand what I mean. We had, it was only 1 or 2 guys that could pull it off, and John Adams and Silas Deane helping a little bit, and Franklin pulled it off over there, and with really grace. How would the occupied territories and capital cities in the Lower South be won back? That was the big question. Here's the Southern Continental Plan. Recapture North Carolina, Georgia, then South Carolina. Drive the British to the coastal capitals, contain an embargo. reinstitute state governments confederated with Congress. That's a big deal. The North Carolina government almost dissolved. The South Carolina government had dissolved and was in exile up in Pennsylvania for a long period of time. But then it came down here. Once this area was cleared, in that blue spot that I showed you about earlier, guess where Rutledge were and many of the previously elected legislators stayed? Right here in the Waxhaws. That's where they were, because this was considered a safe area. They were far enough away from the British at that time. Big deal. They still weren't in session. Greene had to make that happen. Set up and supervise elections, provide security. Now, there's royal government in Georgia at this time. There's a royal governor sitting in Georgia at the time, and the British control Georgia. So, isolate and drive out all the king's forces, area by area, mile by mile. Who's the key man? Your Pennsylvania connection. General Anthony Wayne. He was probably one of the best dragoon fighters and commanders in the American Revolution. This is a guy that, the Special Forces is known as snake eaters. I mean, this guy, his nickname was Black Snake. And look at the characteristics of what a black snake is. And this is his men calling him that. Lower South strategic plan after Yorktown. Capture the countryside. Excuse me. The Continental Plan has been all along. Keep in mind the Continental Army represents Congress and represents all the 13 states. That's why the Army in the field is so important to the negotiators in Europe. Well, the whole idea was, let's go back to Boston at the beginning of the war. The way they were able to choke the British and keep them bottled up in Boston is they denied them what's called host nation forage, host nation support, which you can't supply an army from 3,000 miles away, which England knew that it could not do. You had to go out and get host nation support by going into the countryside. That's another reason why the British had to come so far up here. They needed to control the Santee, which was the breadbasket of the state. They needed to get supplies down from the Great Wagon Road, and they were still sending supplies into Charleston. Well, in Boston, they denied them the countryside, and the British were literally starving. When Knox shows up with all those cannons and they fortified Dorchester Heights, and they said, man, we're out of here. They left, and they never came back to Boston. That's what we had to do here, and that was the same strategy that Greene applied in getting the British bottled up in Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. But he needed more troops. He recruited blacks, enticed royalists in Hessian and British turncoating. He won citizens' hearts and minds. People that were sitting on the fence, he won their hearts and minds by saying, look, we can guarantee your safety if you come with us. They got the French, Spanish, and Dutch to threaten to attack Britain. He needed to have troops staying in England rather than sending more troops over here under the threat that France and Spain were going to invade England. So Lafayette worked this plan perfectly, and I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. So Greene had to recruit a massive spy network, and there were spies up here also that I'm sure worked for him. They're very difficult to uncover. You know, we only recently found out about Hercules Mulligan. How many of you seen the play Hamilton in this room? Many? at least listen to the soundtrack, the first half until Yorktown is surrendered, because there's some very good facts in there. Plus, it's musical. Pick up your spirit a little bit. But Hercules Mulligan was a tailor in New York, and who was taking in all this information and feeding it out to Washington and people like Greene on what's going to happen and where the troop movements are going to be. The British controlled the seaboard, and we saw that earlier with that map. So they could send troops fast, like in 2 or 3 days. They could send troops someplace and land them and get them in position in really a week's time. So getting that spy information was really important. There was Greene set up a very good network. However, it's very difficult when you're looking back in history to try and identify those. On Long Island, we didn't find out about, it was only rumors that there was a spy network on Long Island until someone discovered a chest in the attic, no kidding, in Sag Harbor. And here was all of the papers that actually named the people who were involved in the spy network. That was a treasure trove. Well, if anyone finds anything like that in the attic up here, please let me know right away. So you want to encourage independent insurgent operations against the British. What do I mean, independent insurgent operations? What that means is that you pick off message riders that the British had on horseback, and you bring the papers to Greene, so Greene knows more about what the British are doing than the British commanders do. Very important. Communications with American negotiators in Europe, letting them know that Greene writes to Franklin and some of the other negotiators, Franklin's assistant, and tells them that South Carolina is determined to be rid of the British. Do not negotiate them out of the picture. The Drive to Independence campaign, the 14 months after Yorktown that won independence. We did not win independence at Yorktown. It had to be won after Yorktown. One of the things that is you'll see in very, very few history books, it is in my book, Greene's Mad Dash, what I call Greene's Mad Dash. One of the craziest operations you could ever possibly imagine. Even George Washington writes to John Lawrence after the operation, and he says, this is something that singularly only Nathanael Greene could have pulled off, because he was outmatched, outnumbered, with no ammunition, and actually defeats the British. He actually controls another 50 square miles by doing this mad dash with only 400 people. 400 people. Simultaneously, he gets all of his convalescing troops and has them go down to Jacksonboro, South Carolina, and establish a camp there, because they've already milked out the high hills of Santee. They can't subsist in the high hills of Santee anymore. And Greene pulls this off, goes all the way to Dorchester. A guy with 2,000 troops, no kidding, Doyle, a British officer, Doyle, with heavy cannon, fortified position, a garrison. And Greene approaches him with 400 troops. He spikes his cannon, throws it in the Ashley River, and abandons and goes back to the 15-mile tavern outside of Charleston, and just surrendered the whole area. He only had 4 rounds of ammunition per man in order to do that. First things first, you have to liberate eastern North Carolina. And because Greene cannot attack in on Charleston having his flanks when he can get attacked on his flanks. So the logical thing is you have to take North Carolina first, then you have to take Georgia, then you take the southern headquarters in the capital city in Charleston. So, and this is where the North Carolinians really help out a lot. The militia really comes up and coordinates with the Continentals and surrounds Craig at Fort Johnston, down at Wilmington, And Leslie sees what's about to happen and orders him to withdraw everything down to James Island, and he does. And they surrender without a fight, both the one at Cross Creek, where Fayetteville, North Carolina is, and at Fort Johnston on the coast there. So, bingo. North Carolina's in the clear. It just went blue, the whole state. Then he has to send the army to liberate Georgia, elect a governor loyal to Congress, reseat state legislatures in Augusta. That was a big deal. They had some Hessian guy down there, German guy, and he was probably, even though they don't say this in history books, he looks like he was leaning probably towards the redcoat way a lot. And so he had to come up with this guy. He comes up with a fellow Rhode Island guy, and writes Washington and says, will this guy do? I attach a letter that says he's loyal to Congress and he'll make sure that he installs a republic down there. One of the problems you have about liberating an area is that what is it going to get filled with? We've seen enough wars in our lifetime where we see if there's a vacuum like there were in places like Iraq, guess who moves in? The strongest militias move in and they take over. You don't have a republic. You don't have a democracy. So he was able to pick the right guy and hold elections down there. And also, when this new guy got in, he says, we'd like you to have recruiting bounties for the Hessians. We want the Hessians to turncoat. And we want you to commit to them 200 acres of land. We'll give them protection. They have to serve 6 months in the Continental Army. And guess what? They came over in droves. And that was one of the keys in liberating Georgia. This is all in my book. You're not going to see the liberation of Georgia in many history books because it just wasn't there before. The information wasn't there. So once Georgia is free, then Greene can start pressing farther into into Charleston, and deprive the British of sustenance from those islands, from James Island and John's Island. Everyone knows Charleston in here, right? You have at that time, you kind of had these breadbasket islands, like now they're all condos, but St. James, James Island, John's Island, Daniel's Island. Daniel Island was the cow area, and then you had your other areas, your fishing areas, and then you had your vegetables and potatoes. Here's what the South looked like after Yorktown. After you had my friend Carl Borick here recently, right? So what he talked about is after the British captured Charleston in May of 1780. I'm backing up a year. This is what they did. They set up a chain of forts throughout South Carolina. This is just South Carolina. And so, but by the time of Yorktown, Greene presses in, and he confines now the British garrisons to these areas here, and you can see the dates on here, but basically he has them on a sliver of the coast now. And he's done this by December 1781. December 1781. Now, here's a map that shows how important the roads are. Here's the Great Wagon Road that goes down to Augusta. Here's one of the breakoffs that goes down to Charleston. And you see that this area here, here's Lancaster here, you control this area and deny access to these roads. You can't get supplies in, you can't move troops up and down. That's why this area was so key logistically, so key. Now, I don't know how to enlarge this, but I'm going to suffice to say on this slide that here's an actual map, and these are in my book also, where you can see there's no Lake Marion and no Lake Moultrie. So you can see that how the cavalry would be able to operate without those lakes being there. I mean, right now we have to drive around those lakes all the time, don't we? Well, this is a direct route. Plus you can see the dominance of the Santee, how important. You can visualize how these rivers are so important. These rivers were like the highways at the time. They even had towpaths next to them also, so that you could tow the boats upstream, and they could go in both directions. Okay, Savannah River didn't have any dams to it, so you could bring things down the Savannah River also. It was tremendous. A guy by the name of the guy that wrote The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, he wrote about this bounty that South Carolina had and this natural topography that they had, where they could bring in all of the raw materials from the interior of the country, bring it down to the coast and ship it over to England. That was important to England because why? England is an island. They didn't have any resources. They needed all of our resources. We were it. That's why South Carolina was so important to King George. In addition to that, the way the tides went, if you leave places like Liverpool, you swing around and you go up and you swing around, it comes right to Charleston's doorstep. You get the tides working and the winds working in your direction. So it was a natural. Plus, you can swing back around and go back around to Liverpool. Now, here is what Greene was facing in Charleston. How many of you have heard about the hornwork in Charleston? If you haven't heard about it, please go down to Marion Square. We have it completely marked now. It's amazing. The South Carolina Battleground Trust has put in a tremendous sum of money down there. This is a medieval fortress that the British built to keep Charleston forever. We're talking about 16-foot high walls with cannon on top. And we're talking about for those of you who have been to Charleston, you come into King Street and you see Marion, the Marion Park on the left side. If you imagine that same size park on the other side, that's how big this fort was. It straddled both sides of King Street coming in, because King Street was the only way into the peninsula, and it had it completely blocked. They had moats with alligators in there. They had drawbridges. They had kill holes. It was just like, for those of you who have been to see a castle in Europe, it was just like a castle in Europe. You have a no man's land that stretches out for 2 miles. How are you going to take that? That was Greene's dilemma. And now keep in mind, he has no siege cannon, he has no navy. And there's no precedent. There's no precedent in modern warfare history that you could actually take a fortified town like that without a navy and without siege weapons. Greene did it. And you're going to have to read my book to find out how he did it. But what I basically did is I took half a volume and I condensed it into, so you can follow it along and exactly how he did it and how it happened. It was a fabulous day, and it occurred on December 14th, 1782. I say over and over, and I've made this same speech. I've made 2 speeches in New York at the Fraunces Tavern Museum. I'm very honored to stand in the same place where George Washington did, and where he said farewell to his troops. But I put forth the proposition then that Revolutionary War Victory Day is at Charleston, South Carolina, at Liberty Square. And they did not throw me out. Okay? They gave me an award. So, interestingly enough, George Washington dies on December 14th, 1799. So South Carolina is a battleground for American independence. First, they had to stop the Blitzkrieg, and that's where this area came in when, after the surrender of Charleston by General Lincoln, Continental General Lincoln, which my friend Carl Borick spoke with you about, then they just spread out all over South Carolina, set up these forts, and it was fire and sword. You had to sign an oath of allegiance, and then the deal changed. Even if you signed an oath of allegiance, you did not have to join their army. Well, guess what? They came back two or 3 months later and said, no, we're changing all that. You're going to have to serve. Forget about that remaining neutral. We're not doing any of that. Okay? And if you did not, you'd be slain on the spot, and bad things would happen to your family and farm. Plus, you had to stop the Cherokee and Creek rampages. Had to stop the war of British Allied subjugation across the South. You had to win the War of the Forts. Remember all those forts they had? There's actually a period of time that what I call and some other historians call the War of the Forts. And that was after the British set up these forts. What did the war become at that point? It became, first of all, preservation, while I breathe I hope, and let's do everything we can to take back these forts. The forts just dominated the countryside. They were supposed to impose the power of Europe, of the king, on their subjects. That's why those images had to be attacked. And that war had to be won in order for Greene to be in a position to be able to take back Charleston and kick the British out. Also had to win the moral high ground, hearts and minds. No more Sumter's Law. Rutledge steps in, the governor of South Carolina, and agrees with Greene and other people and says, no more. There's no plundering that's going to be allowed at all. Francis Marion makes absolutely sure none of his men do it. Pickens makes sure that none of his men do it. Anthony Wayne down in Georgia makes sure none of his men do it. And so the trust of the population starts really going heavily now towards the continental side. We're winning hearts and minds. Push the British and armies and allies back to their coastal port capital garrisons. Simultaneously push the Cherokees and Creek warriors back to Appalachians and make treaty. And that's, Mr. Davey was involved in that, by the way. Isolate and attrit British armies trapped in their coastal garrisons to surrender the cities and evacuate without burning. Remember, that's the other thing. If you're going to force the British out by starving them out, they had a habit of leaving the places like Richmond and just burning them to the ground. They did that in Camden, by the way. Claim all 13 colonies and respective capital cities with operating elective governments confederated under the U.S. Congress. After Victory Day, after Revolutionary War Victory Day, and the South is cleared. Now, if you're one of the big cheeses in France or Spain or Russia or the Dutch or something like that, you're the deciders. Who gets independence now? Can they prove the preponderance of control? Can they prove the preponderance of control? Now you look at this map. And then you ask them, okay, I see this new Ireland. Can you prove that you have an operating government there? They could not. Okay, well, we see this thing in New York. How much territory do you have there? Well, we see Washington all around you. Rochambeau, by the way, moved up to the Hudson River also. So he's sitting across from New York. He says, well, what can you show us there? The French are about to attack you. So that's a no count 'em. Okay? And they do have a pretty good place in in Maine and Rhode Island as ports. They're hanging on by a thread in St. Augustine. You know who's helping us out down in St. Augustine, down in Florida? The Spanish. Galvez, fabulous general. He has taken back Pensacola. He's sequestered now the British so they can't come up and support any of these forts. They can't mutually support one another. And anyway, this is the map that they're looking at, and guess what? It's at this time that King George appears before Parliament in February of 1783 after the evacuation. 5 fleets of ships leave Charleston. We're talking about an evacuation much larger than Yorktown that involves loyalists. There's actually 2 phases. Not many people know that there's 2 phases. Many of the loyalists went out 3 months before. They thought that that was going to enable the British to be able to fight better and hold the position better. That it did not work. 5 fleets of ships. King George, one of the fleets, goes back to England and says, we don't have anyone there. And the Parliament says, we're not voting you any more money at all. And they're going to have to, Lafayette has gone over to Cadiz in Spain and has, believe it or not, cobbled together an invasion force in ships of about 15,000 troops to be able to first attack Jamaica and then attack New York and then attack Canada. He has a contract with Congress to take back Canada. The French want Canada back, let's face it. And they're all ready to sail. And this preliminary peace treaty comes before Parliament in January. Believe it or not, Lord Shelburne signs the thing. And if you look at it, it's very pro-United States, because the British were so keen on not giving anything to the French. They put it in there that, yes, we'll give it to you guys, thinking that our government would collapse in no time flat. Sure, we'll give it to you. King George appears before Parliament in February of 1783 and says, I agreed that we would grant them sovereign independence. And Parliament votes and to grant independence to the United States. When the King says we are an independent nation and Parliament votes their approval, guess what? We just got our sovereign independence. That treaty came over here. Congress signed it in April, and we were, at that point in time, a free and independent nation, recognized by the world. And it was because of this map here, not because of Yorktown. Yorktown set the stage, but this served us independence. So we can say, I'm going to start with how I started. Battleground for American independence. American independence was won here. And you have a lot to be proud of. And you have a lot to evangelize. And always remember the 7,500, a good friend of mine has estimated that 7,500 South Carolinians died in the War for American Independence in South Carolina and in other states. And to get their names, everything that you can do to get their names, we are planning a memorial down at Liberty Square, very much similar to the Vietnam Memorial Wall. We want to finally recognize these people after 250 years. But we need their names. 7,500. With that, I'm going to show you a film about Victory Day celebration last year.
The launching of Charleston, America 250th anniversary commemoration period, the Revolutionary War 2.5 centuries ago. Charlestown was a key battleground for American independence from 1775 to 1783. It was the focal point of Britain's forward Southern strategy plans for conquering the errant colonies in blunt and honest.
The colonists therefore resisted the new tax, pleading that only their own elected colonial assemblies could tax them, and that taxation without representation was unjust and unconstitutional.
I am not ashamed to admit that I am a poor substitute for Steve Smith. But I talked to Steve yesterday, and we were both immensely pleased with several aspects of this wonderful Victory Day celebration that Ken Scarlett has put on. First and foremost, the significance of the place we are gathered today. The War marks the beginning and the end of the Southern campaign of the American Revolution. When the British executed their Southern strategy and they came and took Savannah, the next move was to go into South Carolina. They actually marched to the gates of Charleston, May 1779. Came within an eyelash of South Carolina being neutral throughout the rest of the war. We knew that we could not give up the fight. We had to resist. I was responsible for the well-being and care for all my men and the civilians of the city of Charleston.
Almighty God, we make our earnest prayer that Thou wilt keep the United States in Thy holy protection, that Thou wilt incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government. Grant this our supplication, we beseech Thee, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you very much for having me.